The scream came before the sunrise. Elena Voss ran through the mud with her healing bag pressed against her chest, her breath tearing out of her in white clouds. Behind her, the guards of the Alpha King shouted for her to move faster, their voices sharp with fear rather than anger. A sickness had crawled through the border villages for 3 days, taking down grown wolves in hours, and nobody in the royal court could stop it. Elena was the last hope anyone had bothered to send for, and she knew it the moment she saw the soldiers waiting outside her small clinic, their faces pale under the torchlight. She had never been inside the palace walls before. The stone towers rose above her like giants carved from moonlight, and the guards marched her through hallways lined with portraits of kings long dead. She did not have time to admire any of it. A young steward pulled her by the sleeve into a side chamber where 6 men lay on cots, their skin gray, their breathing shallow. The smell of sickness filled the room, thick and metallic. Elena dropped to her knees beside the nearest man and pressed her fingers to his throat. His pulse fluttered like a dying bird. She turned to the steward without looking up. "I need boiling water, crushed silver leaf, and clean linen. Now. Not in a minute. Now." The steward froze, unused to being ordered around by a stranger in patched clothes. But something in her voice made him move. Elena worked through the night, mixing herbs she had gathered from the eastern hills, forcing the sick men to drink bitter tonics, wrapping their bodies in cool cloth to bring down the fever. By dawn, 1 man opened his eyes. By midday, 3 more followed. She did not stop to celebrate. She moved from cot to cot, checking pulses, adjusting doses, refusing food when it was offered to her. It was in the middle of this chaos that the doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and the room went silent, except for the labored breathing of the sick. Alpha King Damien Cross stood in the doorway. Elena had heard stories about him, the way everyone in the kingdom had. They said he ruled with a steady hand and a temper that could level mountains if provoked. They said no woman had ever caught his interest long enough to matter. They said his eyes were the color of storm clouds, and that when he looked at you, you felt the weight of the entire kingdom pressing down on your shoulders. None of the stories had prepared her for the truth of him. He was taller than she expected, broader through the chest, his dark hair damp from travel, his jaw set with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept in days. He wore no crown, only a simple gray coat dusted with road dirt, as if he had ridden straight from some other crisis to this one. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the healed men breathing evenly on their cots, before landing on Elena. She stood there with dried herbs staining her hands, sweat on her brow, her hair falling loose from its braid. She had never felt so unprepared to be looked at. Their eyes met, and the entire room seemed to tilt sideways. Elena felt something crack open inside her chest, a warmth spreading through her limbs so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of a cot to stay standing. Damien did not move. He did not blink. He simply stared at her as though the rest of the world had gone quiet, and she was the only thing left standing in it. "Who is this?" he asked, though his voice had gone rough, quieter than a king's voice should be. The steward stumbled over his words. "The healer, my lord, from the eastern villages. She saved 6 men in a single night." Damien crossed the room in a few long strides, stopping close enough that Elena could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Up close, he smelled like pine and rain, and something under that, something wild, that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not understand. She had treated hundreds of patients in her life. She had never once felt her hands tremble like this. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena," she said. "Elena Voss." He said her name back to her slowly, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. Elena Voss. Something shifted in his expression, a certainty settling over his features like a decision already made. "You will marry me." The room erupted into gasps. Elena felt her own breath catch in her throat. "I beg your pardon?" "I know how strange this sounds." Damien's voice was steady now, though his eyes had not left hers for even a second. "I have never said such a thing to anyone in my life. I did not plan to say it now, but the moment I saw you, I knew. This is not something I can explain with logic. It is something older than logic. My kind calls it a bond. When a wolf finds their true mate, the pull is instant and impossible to resist. I have waited 30 years for this moment, and I will not waste another second pretending I do not feel it. Elena's mind raced through a dozen protests, but her body would not cooperate with any of them. The warmth in her chest had not faded. If anything, it grew stronger the longer she stood near him, as though her very blood recognized something in his that her mind refused to accept. "You do not even know me," she managed. "Then, let me learn," Damien said. "Stay in the palace. Let me court you properly, if that is what you need. But know that my answer will not change. I have found what I was searching for, and I intend to keep it close." The steward at the door was staring at both of them with wide eyes, clearly unsure whether he was witnessing history or madness. Elena looked past Damien to the men she had healed, now sitting up and watching the exchange with quiet fascination despite their weakness. She thought of her small clinic in the eastern village, the modest life she had built there, the freedom she had always guarded so carefully. And then she thought of the warmth still humming beneath her skin, refusing to let her look away from this man's face. "I cannot simply abandon my patients," she said finally. "There are still people in the villages who need care." "Then bring your care here," Damien said. "The palace has empty rooms that could become a proper healing hall. You would want for nothing. Herbs, assistance, whatever you require. I am not asking you to give up who you are, Elena. I am asking you to let me be part of it." It should have been an easy thing to refuse. A king proposing marriage to a stranger within minutes of meeting her was the kind of story that ended badly in every tale Elena had ever heard growing up. And yet standing there, feeling the pull of him settle into her bones like something ancient waking up after a long sleep, she found she could not say no. "I will stay," she said quietly, "for now, to see if what you feel is real, and not simply exhaustion talking." A faint smile crossed Damien's face, the first she had seen from him. It changed his whole expression, softened the hard lines around his eyes. "That is more than I hoped for." Word of what had happened in the healing chamber spread through the palace faster than any fever. By evening, every servant, guard, and noble within the walls had heard some version of the story, each retelling more dramatic than the last. The Alpha King, who had turned away princesses and daughters of great houses for a decade, had proposed to a village healer within moments of laying eyes on her. Not everyone received the news with joy. In a private study lined with old maps and older weapons, Damien's cousin Lucian poured himself a glass of dark wine and listened to the report from one of his informants with a carefully blank expression. Lucian was tall like Damien, sharp-featured, with a smile that rarely reached his eyes. He had spent the better part of 15 years positioning himself as the second most powerful man in the kingdom, quietly building alliances, quietly reminding the court of his own royal blood whenever Damien showed no interest in marriage or heirs. A wife would change everything. A wife meant children. Children meant an unbroken line that pushed Lucian further and further from any claim to the throne he had spent his whole life circling. "A healer," Lucian repeated, swirling the wine in his glass. "From some forgotten village in the east. No family name worth mentioning, no alliances, no wealth, and my cousin wishes to marry her." "The bond is said to be true, my lord," the informant said carefully. "The whole healing chamber witnessed it." Lucian's jaw tightened, though his voice remained smooth. "Bonds can be mistaken. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind. Perhaps once the king has rested, he will see reason." But even as he said the words, Lucian understood the truth of what he was facing. He had seen enough true bonds in his lifetime to recognize the signs, the way a mated pair's eyes never quite left one another, the way their bodies leaned toward each other even in stillness. Whatever had happened in that chamber was not a trick of tired minds. It was real, and it was a problem that required careful handling. He set down his glass and allowed himself a small, private smile. If the bond was real, then it could not simply be argued away. But bonds, unlike blood and birthright, could be disrupted by other means. All he needed was time, patience, and the right opportunity. Elena, unaware of the storm gathering in the shadows of the palace, spent her first days settling into rooms far grander than anything she had ever known. The bed alone was larger than her entire clinic back home, draped in soft blankets and silk pillows that felt strange against her calloused hands. A young maid named Grace was assigned to help her, a cheerful girl with a quick laugh who seemed genuinely delighted by the sudden appearance of a healer in the palace. "Everyone is talking about you," Grace said on the second morning, helping Elena into a dress far finer than anything in her old wardrobe. "They say the king has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you." "I am still getting used to being looked at all," Elena admitted, smoothing the unfamiliar fabric with nervous hands. Grace laughed. "You will get used to it. The whole kingdom will be watching soon enough, especially once the healing hall opens." True to his word, Damien had already ordered an entire wing of the palace converted into a proper healing hall, with rows of clean beds, shelves for herbs, and windows that let in the morning light. Elena spent her days there, training 2 young apprentices, treating minor injuries among the guards, and slowly building the kind of practice she had always dreamed of, but never had the resources to create. Damien visited every evening, sometimes staying only a few minutes to ask about her day, sometimes lingering for hours as she worked, content simply to watch her hands move with quiet confidence over her patients. Their conversations came easily, more easily than Elena had expected from a king. He asked about her childhood in the village, about the mother who had taught her the healing arts, before passing from a sickness Elena had been too young to cure. He told her about his own losses, the father he had buried before he was ready to rule, the responsibilities that had aged him faster than his years. Slowly, carefully, the space between them filled not just with the strange pull of the bond, but with something gentler, something that felt, against all odds, like the beginning of real affection. Not everyone in the palace shared in the growing warmth between them. Elena began to notice the whispers that followed her through the halls, the way certain nobles turned their faces away when she passed, the way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She was, to many of them, an outsider who had somehow bewitched their king, a commoner reaching far above the place she had been born into. She mentioned this to Damien one evening, trying to keep her voice light even as worry gnawed at her. "They do not trust me," she said. "I can feel it every time I walk through the great hall." Damien's expression darkened, protective anger flashing briefly in his gray eyes. "They do not know you. Trust takes time, and I will not force it. But I will not allow anyone to treat you with disrespect either. You are going to be my queen, Elena, whether the old families approve or not." "I have not agreed to marry you yet," she reminded him, though there was no real resistance left in her voice. "No," he agreed, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "But you have not said no either. I am a patient man when the reward is worth waiting for." Elena found herself smiling back, despite the tension still coiled in her stomach. The bond between them had only grown stronger with each passing week, an undeniable pull that made it easier and easier to imagine a future within these palace walls. But even as her heart softened toward Damien, a small, cautious part of her stayed alert to the danger simmering beneath the surface of court life, the danger she could sense but not yet name. She did not know, as she sat beside the king in the golden light of the healing hall, that somewhere in the palace, Lucian was already planning his next move, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the court's uncertainty into something far more dangerous. She did not know that the warmth she felt whenever Damien was near, the bond she had come to trust with her whole heart, would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. For now, there was only the quiet hum of healing herbs, the steady presence of the man beside her, and the fragile, growing hope that perhaps, against every story she had ever been told about kings and commoners, this could actually last. 3 months passed inside the palace walls, and with each week, Elena felt the distance between her old life and her new one grow wider. The healing hall had become a place of quiet pride for her, filled now with rows of drying herbs, carefully labeled jars, and 2 apprentices who had grown skilled enough to handle minor cases on their own. She had saved the life of a guard captain's son after a hunting accident, eased the pain of an elderly noblewoman's failing joints, and delivered 3 healthy babies in the servants' quarters. Slowly, some of the palace staff had begun to warm to her, grateful for a healer who treated everyone with the same careful attention, whether they wore silk or wool. The nobility proved harder to win over. At a formal dinner meant to introduce Elena more fully to the court, she sat at Damien's side while whispered conversations rippled around the long table like waves against rocks. Lady Odette, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, made no effort to lower her voice when she leaned toward her neighbor. "A healer," she said, as though the word itself tasted bitter. "One wonders what other skills she has picked up in that little clinic of hers. Herbs that heal and herbs that harm, I imagine. They come from the very same garden, do they not?" Elena kept her eyes on her plate, her fingers tightening around her fork, though she said nothing. Beside her, she felt Damien's entire body go rigid. "Lady Odette," he said, his voice carrying easily down the table despite its quiet control, "I would advise you to choose your words with more care in my presence." The woman's face paled slightly, and she offered a stiff apology before falling silent. But the damage of the comment lingered in the air long after the meal ended, a small seed of doubt planted in front of the entire court. Elena noticed how several nobles exchanged glances afterward, how the word poison seemed to hang unspoken but present in the room, a shadow nobody wanted to name directly. Later that night, in the privacy of Damien's chambers, Elena finally let her frustration show. "They will never accept me," she said, pacing near the fireplace while Damien watched from a chair, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Every kindness I offer gets twisted into suspicion. I heal someone and they whisper that I am hiding something. I stay quiet, and they whisper that I am plotting. There is no way to win against people who have already decided who I am before I speak a single word." "You do not need to win them all," Damien said gently. "You only need time. Trust is built slowly, especially among people who have spent generations guarding their traditions. Give them reason to doubt their own doubts, and eventually, they will come around. And if they do not..." Damien rose from his chair and crossed the room, taking her hands in his. The warmth of his touch, as always, sent a familiar pulse of comfort through her chest, quieting some of the anxious noise in her mind. "Then it will not matter, because you will still be my queen, and my word carries more weight than any noble's whispered doubts." Elena wanted to believe him completely. Most days, she did, but there were nights when the whispers followed her even into her dreams, nights when she woke with her heart racing, certain she had heard someone speaking her name with venom in a hallway that, upon waking, proved empty. It was around this time that Elena discovered she was carrying Damien's child. She told him on a quiet morning in the healing hall, watching his face carefully as the words left her mouth, unsure how a man carrying the weight of an entire kingdom would receive such news. For a long moment, Damien said nothing at all. Then a smile broke across his face, wide and unguarded in a way Elena had rarely seen from him, and he pulled her into his arms so suddenly that she laughed despite herself. "An heir," he said, his voice thick with something close to wonder. "Elena, this changes everything. This proves the bond beyond any doubt. No one in this court can argue against a child born of a true mating." His joy was infectious, and for a few precious days, Elena allowed herself to simply exist in the warmth of it, setting aside her worries about the whispering nobles and their sharp-eyed suspicions. But joy, she would soon learn, drew its own kind of attention, and not all of it was kind. Lucian received the news of the pregnancy the same evening it was announced to the court, delivered by one of his most trusted informants in the privacy of his chambers. He listened without expression, his fingers steepled beneath his chin until the informant finished speaking and waited nervously for a reaction. "A child," Lucian said finally, his voice flat. "Of course, the bond was never going to be enough on its own. Now there will be an heir to secure her position permanently." He dismissed the informant with a wave of his hand and sat alone in the dim light of his study for a long while, turning the problem over in his mind like a puzzle that demanded a swift solution. Every day that passed strengthened Elena's place in the palace. Every day that passed pushed his own ambitions further out of reach. He had spent too many years cultivating his influence, too many years reminding the old families of his royal blood, to watch it all slip away because his cousin had fallen for a healer with muddy boots and calloused hands. The plan, when it finally came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. He did not need to move against Elena directly, not yet. He needed only to create the right conditions, plant the right doubts, and let the court's own suspicions do the rest of the work for him. A healer with knowledge of herbs was already halfway to being accused of poison in the minds of people who wanted a reason to distrust her. All Lucian needed to do was give them that reason. He began carefully, reaching out to old allies among the noble houses, men and women who had never fully accepted Damien's rule, and who resented the idea of a commoner queen even more. He funded no plots directly, made no bold moves that could be traced back to him. Instead, he simply nurtured the whispers already circulating through the court, adding fuel here and there, a suggestive comment at a dinner party, a carefully worded letter passed between allies, a rumor about strange herbs being delivered to Elena's healing hall from unknown sources. It was slow work, patient work, the kind of work Lucian had always excelled at. And as the weeks passed and Elena's pregnancy became more visible, more undeniable, he felt the pieces of his plan sliding quietly into place. Meanwhile, an incident far from the palace gave Lucian the opening he had been waiting for. Lord Aldrich, a minor noble with a long-standing grudge against Damien's family over an old land dispute, fell violently ill after a private dinner at his own estate, collapsing at the table in front of several witnesses. Physicians summoned to examine him found signs consistent with poison, though the exact substance could not be immediately identified. Lord Aldrich survived, barely, but the incident sent a ripple of fear through the noble houses, each family suddenly eyeing their own dinner tables with suspicion. Lucian moved quickly once the news reached him, careful to appear as though he were simply concerned for the kingdom's safety rather than orchestrating anything himself. "It is troubling," he said during a private meeting with several council members, his voice carrying just the right note of grave concern. "A poisoning within our own borders, so soon after a healer with unknown origins joined the royal household. I do not accuse anyone of anything, of course, but one cannot help but notice the timing. The seed, once planted, grew faster than even Lucian had anticipated. Within days, quiet conversations across the palace had shifted from admiration of Elena's healing skills to nervous speculation about what else those skills might allow her to do. Servants who had once greeted her warmly now offered careful, distant nods. Nobles who had grudgingly begun to accept her presence retreated back into their earlier suspicion, their eyes following her a little too closely whenever she passed. Elena felt the shift immediately, though she could not name its cause. She mentioned it to Damien one evening, her hands resting protectively over the small curve of her stomach. "Something has changed," she said. "I do not know what, but the way people look at me now is different. Colder." Damien frowned, troubled by her words but unable to point to any specific cause himself. He had been consumed by council meetings addressing the poisoning at Lord Aldrich's estate, coordinating investigations, reassuring frightened noble families that the kingdom remained secure. He had not yet connected the growing suspicion around Elena to the same unsettled atmosphere gripping the court. "I will look into it," he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Whatever it is, we will face it together. You have nothing to fear as long as I am beside you." Elena wanted desperately to believe him. And for a little while longer she did, clinging to the warmth of the bond between them, even as the shadows around her grew longer and colder with each passing day. She did not yet know that Lucian's careful whispers had already reached the ears of the very physicians and guards who would one day be called upon to judge her. She did not know that the seeds of suspicion planted so patiently in the court's mind were about to bloom into something far more dangerous than gossip. All she knew, as she sat in the healing hall one quiet afternoon grinding herbs for a soothing tonic, was that the weight in her chest had grown heavier over the past weeks, a quiet unease she could not shake, no matter how tightly Damien held her at night. She placed a protective hand over her stomach and told herself, again and again, that whatever was coming, she would face it. She had survived hardship before. She would survive this, too. She had no way of knowing just how soon that resolve would be tested, or how close the danger circling her had already come. The grand feast to formally present Elena as the future queen was held on a clear autumn evening, the great hall lit with hundreds of candles and decorated with banners bearing the royal crest. Every noble family of consequence had been invited, filling the long tables with silk and jewels and carefully practiced smiles. Elena stood beside Damien at the head of the hall, her hand resting in his, her stomach now rounded enough that no one could mistake the reason for the celebration. She had spent the morning nervous beyond words, Grace fussing over her hair and dress while offering endless reassurances that everything would go smoothly. Elena wanted to believe her. She wanted, more than anything, for this night to mark a turning point, a moment when the whispers finally quieted, and the court accepted what could no longer be denied. Damien had insisted on including an old tradition from his family line, one meant to symbolize trust and unity between mates. Before the feast began, Elena would prepare a ceremonial drink using herbs of her own choosing, a gesture meant to demonstrate her skill and her devotion, offered to Damien in front of the entire court as a blessing over their union. It was an honor, Damien had explained, a way of showing the nobility that her knowledge of herbs was a gift, not a threat. Elena had prepared the drink herself that afternoon in the healing hall, carefully selecting mild herbs known for their calming properties, mixing them with wine and honey exactly as tradition dictated. She had done this dozens of times for patients, measuring doses with practiced precision, and she felt no hesitation as she carried the goblet into the great hall that evening, presenting it to Damien in front of hundreds of watching eyes. He accepted it with a warm smile, raising it toward the assembled court. To the healer who saved this kingdom, and who will one day rule beside me as its queen. He drank. For a moment, nothing happened, and Elena allowed herself a small breath of relief. Then Damien's face changed, his skin draining of color, his hand rising to his throat, as though something had lodged there. The goblet slipped from his fingers and shattered against the stone floor, the dark liquid spreading in a stain that seemed to swallow the candlelight around it. "Damien?" Elena's voice cracked as she reached for him, but he was already stumbling, his knees buckling beneath him. The great hall erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, nobles rose from their seats in a panicked scramble, and somewhere in the noise, Elena heard someone screaming, only realizing seconds later that the scream was her own. She dropped to the floor beside Damien, pressing her hands against his chest, feeling his heartbeat stutter beneath her palms. "Someone get the physician, now!" Palace physicians arrived within minutes. But the minutes felt like hours, each second stretching unbearably as Damien's breathing grew shallow and labored. Elena stayed by his side, refusing to move, even as guards tried to pull her back to make room for the physicians working over him. It was Lucian who spoke first, once the physicians confirmed what everyone in the hall already feared. "Poison," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence that had fallen over the crowd. He did not shout it. He did not need to. The word alone was enough to turn every head in the room toward Elena, still kneeling in the spreading wine stain beside the king's motionless body. "She prepared the drink herself," Lucian continued, stepping forward with an expression of carefully constructed grief. "We all watched her hand it to him. We all watched him drink from a cup that only she touched. I would never, Elena said, her voice shaking, her hands trembling where they still rested against Damien's chest. I have healed him. I have healed everyone in this palace. I would never harm him. I love him. Love does not prevent poison, Lucian said quietly, and though his words were gentle, they landed like a verdict already decided. Guards, take her. No. Elena's protest was drowned out by the sudden movement of armored men closing in around her, hands gripping her arms and pulling her away from Damien, despite her desperate struggle. He needs me. Let me help him, please, I can help him. You have done quite enough, Lucian said, and though his voice remained calm, something in his eyes glinted with an emotion Elena could not quite name in the chaos of the moment, something that almost looked like satisfaction beneath the mask of concern. Elena was dragged from the great hall as physicians worked frantically over Damien's still form, the sounds of the court's panic fading behind her as guards forced her down winding stone stairs into the palace dungeon. The cell they placed her in was cold and bare, lit by a single torch bracketed to the wall outside the bars. She sank to the floor the moment the door slammed shut, her whole body shaking with sobs she could not control. Damien, she whispered into the darkness, her hands pressed against her rounded stomach, as though she could somehow protect the child within her from the disaster unfolding above. Please, please, survive this. She had no way of knowing whether he lived or died. No one came to tell her anything for hours, the silence of the dungeon broken only by dripping water and the occasional distant echo of footsteps she could not identify. She replayed the evening over and over in her mind, searching for any moment where something might have gone wrong, any point where the herbs she had so carefully selected could have been tampered with. She had measured everything herself. She had watched the ingredients from the moment she gathered them to the moment she poured the finished drink into the ceremonial goblet. Someone had interfered. She was certain of it. But proving that truth from inside a locked cell, with the entire court already convinced of her guilt, felt like an impossible task. Above her, in the halls of the palace, Lucian moved swiftly to secure his position. With Damien unconscious and unable to rule, and no formal regent named in advance for such a crisis, the council turned to the next most obvious candidate for temporary authority, the king's own cousin, a man who had spent years building relationships with the very nobles, now looking for someone steady to guide them through the chaos. The kingdom cannot be left without leadership, Lucian told the assembled council that same night, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow. I take no joy in stepping into this role. I only wish to serve until my cousin recovers, if he recovers at all. In the meantime, justice must be served for what has been done to him. The healer who poisoned our king cannot be allowed to walk free while we wait. The council, shaken and desperate for someone to blame, agreed with little resistance. Within a day, word spread through the palace and beyond that Elena Voss, the commoner healer who had captured the Alpha King's heart, stood accused of attempting to murder him, and that a trial would be held to determine her fate. Elena learned of the coming trial from a guard who brought her a meager meal, his expression carefully neutral as he informed her of the date set for her judgment. She asked, desperately, for any news of Damien's condition, but the guard only shook his head and told her he was not permitted to share such information. She spent the following days alone in the darkness of her cell, her only company the slow ache of grief and fear tangled together in her chest. She thought of Grace, wondering if the young maid had been questioned, wondering if anyone in the palace still believed in her innocence at all. She thought of her mentor back in the eastern village, an old healer named Margaret, who had taught her everything she knew about herbs and medicine, wishing desperately that Margaret could somehow appear and testify to her character, to the impossibility of her ever choosing to cause harm with the very skills meant to save lives. Most of all, she thought of Damien, replaying every gentle moment they had shared since the night their eyes first met in the healing chamber, searching those memories for some proof that the bond between them, the love that had grown from that first instant, could somehow survive what was happening now. She did not know that even unconscious, fighting for his life in a chamber sealed off from the rest of the palace. Something in Damien refused to accept the story being told about her. She did not know that deep within whatever place his mind had retreated to during his illness, flashes of her face, her voice, her hands pressed gently against his chest, kept surfacing again and again, an anchor pulling him back toward consciousness even as the poison worked to drag him under. The bond between true mates, ancient and unbreakable, did not simply vanish because of accusations and fear. It remained, quiet and stubborn, waiting for the moment it could reassert itself against the lies being spun to destroy it. But Elena, alone in her cell with only the cold stone walls for company, had no way of knowing this yet. All she could do was wait and hope and hold on to the fragile belief that somewhere above her, the truth was still fighting to be heard. The healing hall stood empty in the days following the feast, its shelves of carefully labeled herbs untouched, its rows of clean beds gathering a thin layer of dust. Grace visited the room alone one evening, unable to sleep, drawn there by some instinct she could not fully explain. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the workbench where Elena had spent countless hours grinding roots and mixing tonics, and something about the stillness of the space struck her as wrong. She had known Elena for months now, had helped her dress, had listened to her worries late at night, had watched her hands work with steady confidence over patient after patient. Nothing about the woman she had come to know matched the story now spreading through the palace like wildfire. Grace did not believe, not for a single moment, that Elena had poisoned the king. She was not alone in her doubt. Corwin, a palace guard who had been assigned to the healing hall's entrance for the better part of a year, found himself equally unconvinced by the official story. He had watched Elena work countless times, had seen the careful precision she brought to every measurement, every dose, every herb selected for its purpose. A woman who treated even the smallest scrape with such meticulous care did not strike him as someone capable of the careless brutality of poison, slipped into a goblet in front of hundreds of witnesses. More troubling to Corwin was a detail he had noticed the morning after the feast, a detail nobody else seemed to have questioned. The herb stores in the healing hall, usually kept in precise order according to Elena's own labeling system, had been subtly disturbed. Jars sat slightly out of place. A drawer that should have been locked stood unlatched. It was a small thing, easy to overlook in the chaos following the king's collapse, but Corwin had spent enough years standing guard over sensitive rooms to recognize the signs of someone searching through them without permission. He mentioned his observation to Grace during a quiet moment near the servants' quarters, keeping his voice low despite the empty hallway around them. "Someone was in that room before the feast," he said. "I do not know who or why, but the herbs were not where Elena always kept them. If someone tampered with her supplies, replaced something, added something, it would explain everything without requiring her to have done anything wrong at all." Grace's eyes widened. "Do you think someone framed her?" "I think it is possible," Corwin said carefully, "and I think, if it happened, we owe it to her to find proof before her trial begins." Their investigation began quietly, careful not to draw attention from anyone loyal to Lucian's growing circle of influence. Grace, with her access to the servants' quarters and her friendly relationships throughout the palace staff, began asking gentle questions among the kitchen workers and cleaning staff about who might have been near the healing hall in the days before the feast. Corwin, using his position as a guard, reviewed the schedules of who had been assigned to patrol that section of the palace, cross-referencing names against known associates of Lucian. The pieces came together slowly, each small discovery building toward a picture neither of them wanted to fully believe until the evidence became impossible to ignore. A kitchen maid recalled seeing an unfamiliar servant near the healing hall storage room 2 days before the feast, someone she did not recognize from the regular staff rotation. A stable hand mentioned overhearing a conversation between two of Lucian's known allies, speaking in hushed tones about a delivery that needed to be handled carefully, though he had not thought much of it at the time. Most damning of all, Corwin managed to track down the guard who had been assigned to patrol the healing hall corridor on the night in question, only to discover the man had been unexpectedly reassigned to a different post at the last moment, replaced by someone with looser standards for who was allowed to pass through unquestioned. "It points to Lucian," Corwin said one evening, laying out everything they had gathered in a quiet corner of the servants' quarters, speaking barely above a whisper. "Every thread we pull leads back to someone connected to him. But knowing something and proving it in front of a court are two very different things." Grace wrung her hands anxiously. "The trial is only days away. What do we do?" "We keep digging," Corwin said, "and we find a way to reach Elena's mentor. If anyone can speak to her character and her skill with herbs, it is someone who trained her from the beginning." Sending word to the eastern village took time they did not have much of, but Corwin managed to arrange for a trusted messenger to ride through the night, carrying an urgent letter explaining the situation and pleading for Margaret to come to the palace as quickly as possible. Whether she would arrive before the trial began remained uncertain, but it was the best chance they had at building a defense strong enough to counter the weight of suspicion already stacked against Elena. Meanwhile, in the sealed chamber where Damien remained unconscious, something had begun to shift. The physicians attending him noted small changes in his condition, his breathing growing steadier, his color slowly returning despite his continued unresponsiveness. They could not explain the improvement medically, though privately, several of them wondered if the strength of a true mate bond played some role in his gradual recovery, a possibility ancient texts on wolf physiology had long suggested, but modern medicine rarely witnessed firsthand. Damien's mind, adrift in the fog of poison and fever, replayed fragments of memory that felt more vivid than dreams. He saw Elena's hands moving over patients in the healing hall, steady and sure. He saw her laughing at something Grace had said, a rare, unguarded moment of joy he had witnessed only once but had never forgotten. He saw her face on the night he proposed, the careful uncertainty in her eyes slowly giving way to something warmer as she agreed to stay. None of these memories aligned with the accusation now hanging over her. Something deep within him, something instinctual and unshakable, insisted that whatever had happened in that great hall, Elena's hands had not been the ones to cause it. He surfaced from unconsciousness in fragments over the following days, brief moments of clarity followed by exhausted sleep, his body still fighting to purge the last traces of poison from his system. During one such moment, his eyes opened fully for the first time since the feast, and he found himself staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling in the palace's sealed recovery chamber, a physician, startled by his sudden alertness, rushing to his side. "My lord," the physician said, relief evident in his voice. "You are awake. How do you feel?" Damien's throat felt raw, his voice barely more than a whisper when he finally managed to speak. "Elena. Where is Elena?" The physician hesitated, exchanging an uneasy glance with the guard stationed near the door before answering carefully. "She has been accused of poisoning you, my lord. She is being held for trial." The words hit Damien like a physical blow, sharper than any pain the poison had inflicted on his body. "That is not possible," he managed, struggling to push himself upright despite his weakened state. "She would never. Get me a council member. Now. I need to know everything that has happened since I collapsed." Word of the king's awakening spread through the palace within hours, though his condition remained fragile enough that physicians insisted he remain confined to his recovery chamber for several more days before attempting to move or exert himself in any significant way. Lucian, informed of his cousin's survival, allowed himself only a brief flicker of frustration before adjusting his plans accordingly. Damien's awakening complicated things, but the trial had already gained enough momentum among the frightened nobility that Lucian believed it could still proceed as planned, especially if he could delay any direct interference from a king still too weak to leave his bed. He visited Damien's chamber that same evening, his expression carefully arranged into one of relieved concern as he approached the bedside. "Cousin," Lucian said warmly, I cannot express how relieved I am to see you awake. The entire kingdom has been holding its breath. Tell me what happened, Damien said, his voice still rough but carrying an unmistakable edge of command despite his weakened state. Tell me everything, and do not leave anything out. Lucian recounted the events of the feast with practiced precision, emphasizing the goblet Elena had prepared, the witnesses who had watched her hand it to him, the physicians who had confirmed poison in his system immediately after he drank. He spoke with the careful tone of a man reluctantly delivering painful truths, watching Damien's face closely for any sign of doubt he could exploit. But Damien, even in his weakened state, felt something false in the smoothness of the account. A story too neatly assembled, too conveniently pointed in a single direction. He said nothing of his suspicions to Lucian directly, choosing instead to nod slowly and thank his cousin for the update, watching him leave the chamber with narrowed eyes once the door closed. Alone again, Damien closed his eyes and reached inward, searching for the faint thread of the bond that connected him to Elena, a sensation he had felt every day since the moment they met. It was fainter now, strained by distance and the walls of the dungeon separating them, but it was still there, still steady beneath the surface of his exhaustion. And through that thread, faint but unmistakable, he felt her fear, her grief, her desperate, unwavering innocence. Whatever the trial ahead intended to prove, Damien knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that Elena had not poisoned him. And he intended to make certain the entire kingdom understood that truth before it was too late to matter. The dungeon offered little comfort in the days that followed, but Elena found herself surprised by small, unexpected kindnesses that helped her hold on to the fragile hope she carried alongside her grief. A young guard named Oliver, assigned to watch her cell during the night shift, began quietly slipping her extra blankets when the stone floor grew too cold, and warm bread instead of the stale portions typically given to prisoners. "I have a sister who nearly died birthing her first child," Oliver admitted one evening, keeping his voice low as he passed a bowl of broth through the bars. "The healer who saved her used methods not so different from what I have heard about you. I do not believe the things they are saying, my lady, not for a moment." His words meant more to Elena than he likely understood, a small reminder that not everyone in the palace had already condemned her in their hearts. She thanked him quietly, cradling the warm bowl in her hands, grateful for even this small measure of comfort in the growing darkness of her situation. News of Damien's awakening reached her a few days later, carried by Oliver himself, who could barely contain his excitement as he relayed the information through the bars of her cell. "He is alive," Elena whispered, tears springing to her eyes as relief flooded through her chest so powerfully that she had to grip the bars to steady herself. "He is truly alive?" "Awake and recovering, my lady. The physicians say he grows stronger each day." For the first time since her arrest, Elena allowed herself to feel something other than fear. If Damien had survived, if he was awake and aware, surely he would remember the bond between them, would remember her hands pressed against his chest as she begged for someone to help him. Surely he would not believe the accusations being spread against her. But days passed, and no word came directly from Damien himself. No visit, no message, nothing to confirm that his memory of their bond remained as strong as she desperately hoped. Elena told herself this was simply due to his continued recovery, his physicians likely restricting visitors as he regained his strength. Still, the silence gnawed at her, feeding doubts she tried desperately to push away. Meanwhile, Corwin and Grace continued their careful investigation, growing more confident with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. The unfamiliar servant seen near the healing hall before the feast had finally been identified through careful questioning of the kitchen staff, a young man named Silas who had been hired only weeks earlier under circumstances that, upon closer examination, traced back to a recommendation from one of Lucian's known associates. Corwin managed to locate Silas working in a distant section of the palace kitchens, and after some careful, non-threatening conversation, the young man's nervous demeanor suggested he knew far more than he was willing to admit outright. It took several patient visits, and a promise of protection should he choose to speak honestly, before Silas finally broke down and confessed the truth. "I was paid," Silas admitted, his voice trembling as he spoke in a hushed corner of the kitchen storeroom, glancing repeatedly toward the door to ensure no one else could hear. "A man approached me before I was even hired here, promised good coin if I found work in the palace, and did as I was told when the time came. I did not know what I was doing was so serious. I thought it was simple mischief, not poison, I swear it." Corwin asked, keeping his voice calm despite the surge of vindication rushing through him. "I was given a small vial," Silas said, "told to slip into the healing hall storage room when the healer was occupied elsewhere, and to add its contents to one specific jar of herbs, the one she used most often for calming tonics. I did not know what was in the vial. I was told it was harmless, meant only to cause the king mild discomfort so the healer would be blamed for a small mistake, nothing more. I did not know anyone intended to actually poison him." "Who gave you the vial?" Corwin pressed. Silas hesitated, fear flickering across his face before he finally whispered a name that confirmed everything Corwin and Grace had already suspected. "Lord Lucian's steward. He said Lord Lucian himself sent instructions, though I never spoke with the Lord directly." It was the confirmation they needed, though Corwin understood immediately that a frightened kitchen servant's testimony alone would not be enough to overturn the mounting case against Elena, especially with Lucian's growing influence over the council during Damien's continued recovery. They needed more, something concrete enough to withstand the scrutiny of a formal trial, something that connected directly back to Lucian himself rather than simply to those acting on his behalf. "We need the vial," Corwin said, thinking quickly, "or proof of where it came from. Do you still have it?" Silas shook his head. "I disposed of it as instructed, near the eastern gardens, but there may still be traces, if someone searched carefully enough." That same night, under cover of darkness, Corwin and Grace searched the eastern gardens with a small lantern, carefully checking the areas Silas had described. It took hours of patient searching before Grace finally spotted something half-buried beneath a cluster of rose bushes, a small glass vial with traces of dark residue still clinging to its interior, along with a scrap of parchment that had apparently been used to wrap it, bearing a partial wax seal that matched the crest used by Lucian's private household. "This is it," Grace breathed, carefully lifting the vial and parchment with a cloth to avoid disturbing any evidence further. "Corwin, this is exactly what we needed." Their next challenge was reaching Damien directly, bypassing the careful control Lucian had managed to establish over who was permitted access to the recovering king. Corwin, using his standing as a palace guard, requested an audience through official channels, only to be repeatedly told that the king remained too weak for visitors outside his immediate physicians and closest advisors, a group Lucian had carefully curated to exclude anyone who might carry information he did not wish reaching Damien's ears. Frustrated but undeterred, Corwin turned to Oliver, whose position guarding Elena's cell had made him sympathetic to their cause from the beginning. Together, they devised a plan to smuggle a message directly to one of the physicians attending Damien, a man named Edwin who had served the royal family for decades and whose loyalty, Corwin believed, remained with the crown rather than with Lucian's ambitions. The message, carefully worded and accompanied by the vial and parchment as physical evidence, reached Edwin 2 days before Elena's scheduled trial. The old physician read it in the privacy of his study, his expression growing increasingly grave as he examined the vial's residue and the partial seal on the parchment wrapping. He brought the evidence directly to Damien that same evening, waiting until the guards Lucian had posted outside the recovery chamber had rotated shifts, choosing a moment when he could speak with the king in relative privacy. "My lord," Edwin said quietly, laying the vial and parchment on the table beside Damien's bed, "I believe you need to see this." Damien, still weak but growing stronger with each passing day, listened with mounting fury as Edwin explained everything Corwin and Grace had uncovered: the servant's confession, the location of the vial, the seal matching Lucian's household. By the time the old physician finished speaking, Damien's hands had curled into fists against the bedsheets, his gray eyes darkening with an anger he had rarely allowed himself to feel so openly. "My own cousin," he said quietly, the words heavy with betrayal. "He would poison me and let Elena burn for a crime he committed himself, all to secure a throne he was never meant to hold." "The evidence is strong, my lord," Edwin said carefully, "but circumstantial without further confirmation. The trial begins in 2 days. If we move too quickly without proper preparation, Lord Lucian may find a way to discredit what we have gathered before it can be properly presented." Damien's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, forcing himself to think strategically, despite the fury still burning through his chest. "Then we prepare carefully. Bring me Corwin and this young woman, Grace, directly. I want to hear everything myself, and I want a plan in place before that trial begins. Elena has suffered enough in that cell. I will not allow another day to pass without her knowing the truth is finally being uncovered." As night fell over the palace, plans began taking shape in careful whispers throughout hidden corners and locked chambers, a quiet resistance building against Lucian's carefully constructed lies. Elena, still unaware of the evidence-gathering strength just beyond the walls of her cell, spent the night curled beneath Oliver's borrowed blankets, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, praying to whatever ancient forces governed the bonds between true mates that somehow, some way, the truth would find its way into the light before it was too late. She did not know how close that truth already stood to breaking free. Margaret arrived at the palace gates just after dawn, 2 days before the trial, her travel cloak still dusted with the mud of the eastern roads. She had ridden through the night without rest, the moment Corwin's letter reached her small cottage, her old bones aching with every mile but her resolve unshaken. Elena was like a daughter to her, the girl she had trained since childhood in the delicate art of healing, and she would not sit idle in her village while that same girl faced execution for a crime Margaret refused to believe she had committed. Corwin met her at the gate himself, having arranged for her arrival through a sympathetic steward who owed him a favor from years past. He explained everything as they walked quickly through the palace corridors, the confession from Silas, the vial recovered from the eastern gardens, the seal connecting it to Lucian's household, and the king's growing determination to see the truth uncovered before the trial could proceed. "She has been alone this whole time," Margaret said, her voice tight with worry as they approached the entrance to the dungeon stairs. "Can I see her? Please, I need to see her." Corwin arranged a brief visit, bending the rules just enough to allow the old healer a few precious minutes with Elena before the trial preparations demanded his attention elsewhere. When Margaret descended the stone stairs and saw Elena through the bars of her cell, pale and thin, her dress no longer fitting properly over her rounded stomach, she felt her heart break clean in two. "Oh, my girl," Margaret whispered, reaching through the bars to take Elena's hands in her own weathered ones. "What have they done to you?" Elena's composure, carefully held together through weeks of fear and uncertainty, finally crumbled at the sight of her mentor's familiar face. She wept freely for the first time since her arrest, clinging to Margaret's hands as though they were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned entirely against her. "I did not do this," Elena said between broken sobs. "I would never harm him, Margaret. I love him. I would never harm anyone with the gifts you taught me. I know, child. I know you would not." Margaret's own eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady, offering the same quiet strength she had always provided during Elena's training years ago. "And soon, everyone else will know it too. There are good people working to prove your innocence, Elena. You are not as alone as you believe." Their reunion was brief, cut short by the arrival of guards insisting visiting hours had ended, but it left Elena with something she had been desperately missing since her arrest: genuine hope, grounded not simply in wishful thinking, but in the knowledge that people she trusted were actively fighting for her freedom. Above in the palace proper, preparations for the confrontation ahead moved forward with careful precision. Damien, growing stronger each day though still not fully recovered, met privately with Corwin, Grace, Edwin, and Margaret to assemble every piece of evidence into a case strong enough to withstand whatever defense Lucian might mount once accused directly. "He will not confess easily," Damien said, pacing slowly across his chamber, testing the strength returning to his legs with each measured step. "My cousin has spent his entire life building careful appearances. He will have prepared for the possibility of discovery, even if he believes himself untouchable." "The seal on the parchment matches his household exactly," Corwin said, laying the evidence out once more on the table between them. "Combined with Silas's testimony and the timing of the guard reassignment on the night of the feast, it paints a clear picture for anyone willing to look at it honestly." "The council may not be willing," Edwin warned. "Several members have grown close to Lord Lucian during your recovery, my lord. Loyalties within these walls are not always what they appear on the surface." Damien's expression hardened with quiet determination. "Then we make certain the evidence is undeniable, presented in a way that leaves no room for doubt or manipulation. Elena's trial will proceed as scheduled, but it will not end the way my cousin intends." Margaret, listening carefully throughout the discussion, offered her own contribution to the growing strategy. "I trained Elena myself, from the time she was a young girl gathering herbs alongside me in the Eastern Hills. I can speak to her character, her methods, her unwavering respect for the responsibility that comes with healing. Let me testify. Let the court hear from someone who has known her far longer than any of these nobles who judge her based on rumor alone." Damien nodded, grateful for the old healer's willingness to speak on Elena's behalf. "Your testimony will matter greatly. Thank you for coming so quickly, and for believing in her when so many others chose suspicion instead." "I would have crossed far greater distances for that girl," Margaret said simply. "She deserves every chance to clear her name, and I intend to make certain she gets it." As the day of the trial approached, Lucian remained largely unaware of how thoroughly his careful scheme had begun unraveling behind the scenes. He continued his role as acting regent with practiced confidence, addressing the council with reassuring words about justice and stability, quietly working to ensure the trial proceeded exactly as he had planned from the beginning. He had arranged for several council members sympathetic to his growing influence to preside over the proceedings, believing this would guarantee a swift conviction regardless of whatever defense Elena might attempt to offer. He did not know that Damien had already recovered enough strength to attend the trial personally, choosing to keep this fact carefully hidden from anyone outside his most trusted circle, until the moment it would carry the greatest impact. He did not know that a young kitchen servant's confession, combined with a vial recovered from the Eastern Gardens, sat waiting to be presented before the very council he believed he had already secured in his favor. On the evening before the trial, Elena received an unexpected visitor to her cell, arriving under cover of darkness with guards specifically arranged by Corwin to look the other way for a brief window of time. She had not expected to see Damien himself, still moving carefully as his body continued recovering, but the moment she saw his familiar silhouette approaching through the dim torchlight, every fear she had carried these past weeks seemed to momentarily lift from her shoulders. "Damien." His name left her lips like a prayer finally answered, her hands gripping the bars as he approached, his own hand covering hers immediately, warm and steady, despite everything they had both endured. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond simple apology. "Sorry that you have suffered in this place. Sorry that I could not reach you sooner. Sorry that anyone in this kingdom ever believed you capable of such a thing." "You know it was not me," Elena said, searching his face desperately for confirmation, needing to hear the words directly from him after weeks of uncertainty. "I have known it from the moment I woke," Damien said firmly. "I felt your innocence through our bond, even when I could not yet speak the words aloud. And tomorrow, the entire court will know it too. I promise you, Elena, this ends tomorrow, and it ends with the truth finally standing where it belongs." Elena allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, to fully believe that tomorrow might bring not another cruel disappointment, but the justice she had been desperately praying for. As Damien's hand tightened around hers through the cold iron bars, she felt the familiar warmth of their bond pulse steadily between them, unbroken despite everything that had tried to tear it apart. A quiet promise that whatever awaited them in the Great Hall tomorrow, they would face it together, and they would finally win. The Great Hall, transformed once again for a very different purpose than the celebration it had hosted weeks before, filled steadily with nobles and council members as morning light streamed through the tall windows. Where candles and banners had once decorated the space for a joyous announcement, now rows of formal seating had been arranged for judgment. A raised platform positioned at the front where the presiding council members would sit to hear evidence and render their verdict. Elena was led into the hall in simple prisoner's clothing, her wrists bound loosely with rope, her chin held high despite the exhaustion and fear that weeks in the dungeon had carved into her features. Whispers followed her every step, curious and hostile eyes tracking her progress toward the small platform reserved for the accused. She searched the crowd briefly for any familiar face, finding Grace near the back with tears already threatening in her eyes, and Corwin standing rigid near the entrance, his hand resting purposefully near the hilt of his sword. She did not immediately see Damien, and for one horrible moment, doubt crept back into her chest, wondering if his promise from the night before had somehow already been overturned by whatever political pressures Lucian continued to wield during his cousin's recovery. Lucian took his position at the front of the hall, addressing the assembled council with the same practiced confidence he had displayed throughout his weeks as acting regent. "We gather today for a solemn purpose," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall, "to seek justice for an attack against our king, an attack that nearly cost him his life, allegedly carried out by the very woman he had chosen to elevate to the highest position in this kingdom." He continued outlining the case against Elena with careful precision, recounting the events of the feast, the goblet she had prepared, the physicians who confirmed poison in Damien's system immediately after he drank from it. Several council members nodded along as he spoke, their expressions already leaning toward conviction before a single piece of formal evidence had even been presented. "The healer will now be given opportunity to speak in her own defense," Lucian said, gesturing toward Elena with an expression of practiced neutrality that did nothing to hide the satisfaction lurking beneath it. Before Elena could step forward, the great doors at the back of the hall opened with a heavy creak that drew every eye in the room. Damien entered, moving with careful but deliberate strength, dressed formally for the first time since his collapse, flanked by Edwin and several guards loyal directly to the crown rather than to Lucian's temporary authority. The entire hall rose in stunned silence, nobles and council members alike scrambling to their feet in a mixture of relief and shock at seeing their king standing before them, clearly recovered enough to reclaim his position. Lucian's carefully maintained composure faltered for just a fraction of a second before he schooled his features back into something resembling welcome. "Cousin, this is a wonderful surprise. We did not expect you strong enough to attend." "I imagine you did not," Damien said, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the remaining whispers throughout the hall as he made his way toward the front, taking a position beside the council platform rather than sitting in judgment himself, choosing instead to observe the proceedings as they unfolded. "But I would not miss the trial of the woman I intend to marry, especially when I have reason to believe the true story behind my poisoning has not yet been told." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles at his words, uncertainty flickering across many faces as they tried to reconcile the king's presence with the case Lucian had so carefully constructed against Elena. "My lord," Lucian said carefully, "the evidence against the healer is substantial. Witnesses saw her prepare the drink. Physicians confirmed the poison immediately following." "And what if I told you?" Damien interrupted, his gray eyes fixed steadily on his cousin's face. "That evidence exists, proving the herbs Elena used were tampered with before that feast, by someone with no connection to her whatsoever." The hall fell into stunned silence. Lucian's expression remained carefully controlled, though Elena, watching closely from the platform where she stood, noticed the faint tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders. "That is a serious accusation," Lucian said slowly. "Do you have proof of such a claim?" "I do," Damien said, and at his signal, Corwin stepped forward from his position near the entrance, carrying with him the vial recovered from the Eastern Gardens, along with the scrap of parchment bearing its telling seal. What followed unfolded with careful precision, exactly as they had planned the night before. Corwin presented his findings to the council, explaining the disturbed herb stores discovered the morning after the feast, the guard reassignment that had allowed an unfamiliar servant access to the healing hall storage room. Edwin confirmed the physical evidence, the vial's residue matching traces found in the herbs Elena had used for the ceremonial drink. And finally, Silas himself was brought forward, visibly nervous but resolute, to confess before the entire council exactly what he had done and who had instructed him to do it. "I was told it was harmless," Silas said, his voice trembling but clear enough to carry through the silent hall. "I did not know it would cause such harm. I was paid by Lord Lucian's steward, following instructions. The steward said came directly from Lord Lucian himself." Every eye in the hall turned toward Lucian, whose composure had begun to crack visibly beneath the mounting weight of evidence and testimony arrayed against him. "This is absurd," Lucian said, his voice rising with the first genuine emotion he had shown throughout the proceedings. "A frightened servant's confession, extracted under who knows what pressure, proves nothing. A vial found buried in a garden could belong to anyone. The seal on the parchment matches your household crest precisely," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying the full weight of royal authority despite his still recovering strength. "And the guard who allowed this servant access to the healing hall has already confirmed, under formal questioning this very morning, that he was reassigned by direct order from your office, coincidentally on the exact night this poisoning occurred." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, the carefully constructed case Lucian had built against Elena crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of contradicting evidence. Elena, still standing on the platform reserved for the accused, felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in weeks, a fragile thread of hope strengthening with each new piece of testimony presented against the man who had orchestrated her downfall. "Cousin," Damien continued, stepping closer to where Lucian stood, his voice quiet now but no less commanding for its softness. "Why would you do this? Why would you poison your own family and let an innocent woman burn for a crime you committed yourself?" For a long moment, Lucian said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes darting across the hall as though searching for some escape from the trap that had so thoroughly closed around him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier smoothness, replaced by something raw and bitter that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for far longer than anyone in the hall had realized. "Because I have spent my entire life serving a crown that was never meant to be yours alone," he said, his composure finally shattering completely. "Our grandfather intended for the line to remain flexible, for the strongest candidate to rule regardless of exact birth order. You were given everything, cousin, while I built alliances and earned respect through decades of careful work, only to watch you throw it all away on a healer with no name, no family, no right to sit beside a throne I have spent my entire life preparing myself to inherit." His confession, delivered in a moment of furious clarity, left no remaining doubt among the assembled council. Guards moved forward at Damien's signal, securing Lucian before he could attempt any further defense or escape, his ambitions finally laid bare before the very court he had spent years carefully manipulating. Elena, released from her bindings by a guard acting on Damien's immediate order, found herself pulled into his arms the moment she stepped down from the platform, his embrace fierce and protective despite his still recovering strength. Around them, the great hall erupted into a chaos of relieved murmurs and shocked whispers, the story of Lucian's betrayal already beginning to spread through the assembled nobility with the same speed the false accusations against Elena had once traveled. "It is over," Damien whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "It is finally over, and everyone now knows the truth." Elena, tears streaming freely down her face, could only nod against his chest, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion, and the sudden, dizzying weight of freedom returning to her shoulders after weeks of believing it might never come at all. The days following the trial passed in a strange blur for Elena, filled with the careful process of rebuilding what weeks of imprisonment and public suspicion had torn apart. Lucian, stripped of his titles and confined to a heavily guarded chamber, while the council determined the appropriate consequences for his treason, no longer posed any threat to the fragile peace slowly returning to the palace. The council, shaken by how thoroughly they had allowed his careful manipulations to influence their judgment, moved quickly to formally clear Elena's name, issuing a public declaration of her innocence that was read aloud in every corner of the kingdom. Word spread through the palace and beyond with remarkable speed. The same nobles who had once whispered suspicious rumors about the healer with muddy boots now found themselves eager to distance themselves from those earlier judgments, offering awkward apologies or careful silence whenever Elena passed through the halls. She accepted these shifting attitudes with more grace than many expected, too exhausted from the weight of recent events to hold on to resentment for people who had simply been swept up in a scheme far more calculated than their own individual prejudices. Lady Odette, whose earlier comments about herbs that heal and herbs that harm had helped plant the first seeds of public suspicion, approached Elena privately during a quiet afternoon in the palace gardens, her expression uncharacteristically humble. "I owe you an apology," she said, her sharp features softened by something that looked genuinely like shame. "My words contributed to the doubt that nearly cost you everything. I did not know, of course, that Lord Lucian was actively working to destroy you. But I allowed my own prejudice against your origins to make me an easy tool for his manipulation, and I am deeply sorry for the harm that caused." Elena studied the woman for a long moment before offering a small, tired smile. "Thank you for saying so. I cannot pretend those weeks were not among the hardest of my life, but I would rather move forward with understanding than carry bitterness that serves no one. Perhaps we can begin again, with clearer eyes this time." Lady Odette's relief was evident, and though their relationship would never blossom into close friendship, a quiet respect grew between them in the months that followed, a small but meaningful step toward the kind of acceptance Elena had once believed impossible within the palace's rigid social structure. Damien, meanwhile, dedicated himself fully to both his continued physical recovery and the necessary work of restoring stability to a kingdom shaken by his cousin's betrayal. He met daily with council members, carefully rebuilding trust in leadership that had been badly damaged by how easily Lucian had manipulated the crisis to his own advantage. He also made certain, in every public address and private conversation, to speak clearly and firmly about Elena's innocence, refusing to allow any lingering doubt to fester unchallenged. "The kingdom needs to understand," he told his council during one such meeting, "that the woman who will stand beside me as queen was nearly destroyed by the very prejudices some of you allowed to guide your judgment. I do not say this to shame anyone further, but to ensure such a failure never happens again. Elena Voss saved lives with her healing skills before she ever set foot in this palace, and she will continue saving lives as your queen. I expect her to be treated with the respect that truth, not birthright alone, has always deserved." His words, delivered with quiet but unmistakable authority, helped shift the remaining undercurrents of doubt still lingering among the more traditional members of the court. Slowly, steadily, the palace began settling into a new rhythm, one where Elena's presence in the healing hall was met increasingly with gratitude rather than suspicion, where her growing friendship with Grace and continued partnership with Corwin became simply an accepted part of daily palace life rather than a source of scandal. Margaret remained at the palace for several weeks following the trial, both to support Elena through the final stages of her pregnancy and to help formally establish the healing hall as a permanent institution within the royal household. Together, the two women trained additional apprentices, expanded the herb garden Elena had first cultivated with such limited resources, and slowly built something that promised to outlast any individual controversy or scandal, a lasting legacy of care and skill that would serve the kingdom for generations to come. "You have built something remarkable here," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Elena move through the healing hall with the same steady confidence she had always carried, now paired with a new quiet strength earned through everything she had survived. "I am proud of you, Elena. More proud than I know how to properly express." "I could not have done any of it without everything you taught me," Elena said, pausing to embrace her mentor warmly. "And I could not have survived these past weeks without you, Corwin, and Grace fighting for the truth when I could not fight for myself. That is what family does," Margaret said simply. "Blood or not, we protect our own." As Elena's pregnancy neared its final weeks, the palace prepared for what would become a joyous celebration long overdue, the wedding between their Alpha King and the healer who had captured his heart from the very first moment their eyes met. Unlike the tense, scandal-tinged feast that had once threatened to destroy everything between them, this new celebration was planned with careful attention to genuine joy rather than political necessity, a true reflection of the bond that had survived betrayal, imprisonment, and near tragedy to emerge stronger than ever. Grace, promoted from her position as a simple maid to Elena's trusted personal companion, threw herself into wedding preparations with tireless enthusiasm, coordinating with palace staff to ensure every detail reflected both royal tradition and Elena's own simple, heartfelt preferences. Corwin, recognized formally by Damien for his role in uncovering the truth behind Elena's false accusation, received a promotion to captain of the palace guard, a position he accepted with quiet pride and continued dedication to protecting the royal family he had come to genuinely respect and admire. The night before the wedding, Elena stood alone in the healing hall, one hand resting on her rounded stomach, watching the moonlight stream through the windows onto the rows of carefully tended herbs that had become such an integral part of her new life. She thought back to the frightened, exhausted healer who had first arrived at these palace gates months ago, uncertain of her place in a world so different from the simple village life she had always known. She thought of the terror of the dungeon, the grief of believing she might never see justice served, the desperate hope she had clung to through countless dark nights alone. She had survived all of it, not through luck alone, but through the loyalty of friends who refused to abandon her, the unbreakable strength of a bond that had withstood every attempt to tear it apart, and her own quiet resilience that had carried her through even the darkest moments with her sense of self and purpose still intact. Tomorrow she would finally become queen, not through desperate necessity or political maneuvering, but through genuine love that had proven itself capable of surviving the worst betrayals a scheming heart could devise. She placed both hands gently over her stomach, feeling the small, steady movements of the child growing within her, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel peace. Whatever challenges still lay ahead in the life of a queen, she felt ready to face them, secure in the knowledge that she would never again face such trials completely alone. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear skies and a gentle warmth that seemed, to those gathered within the palace walls, like nature itself offering its blessing on the day ahead. The great hall had been transformed once more, this time draped in soft blues and golds rather than the deep reds and formal banners of the earlier feast. Flowers gathered from the very gardens where crucial evidence had once been discovered, woven carefully into every arrangement throughout the space. Elena stood in her chambers as Grace fastened the final buttons of her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown that reflected both her royal position and her humble origins, embroidered with delicate patterns of the same herbs she had spent her life learning to cultivate and use. She caught her own reflection in the mirror and, for a moment, hardly recognized the woman staring back at her, no longer the frightened village healer who had first been summoned to the palace so many months ago, but someone who had weathered betrayal and imprisonment and emerged with her strength and compassion fully intact. "You look beautiful," Grace said, her eyes glistening with happy tears as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. Truly, Elena, like you were always meant to stand where you are about to stand today. I could not have imagined any of this, that first day I arrived here, Elena admitted, smoothing the fabric of her dress with hands that, despite everything, remained steady and sure. Frightened, uncertain, treating strangers in a room full of people who did not trust me. And now, look at everything that has happened since. The kingdom is ready to celebrate you properly this time, Grace said. No whispers, no suspicion, only joy. Margaret arrived shortly after, dressed in her finest clothes for the occasion, tears already forming in her eyes as she took in the sight of the young woman she had trained and loved as her own daughter, standing radiant and ready to become queen. Your mother would be so proud, she said quietly, embracing Elena carefully to avoid disturbing her elaborate dress. I only wish she could have lived to see this day herself. I feel her with me, Elena said softly, especially today. The ceremony itself unfolded with a warmth and simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the tense formality of the earlier feast that had nearly destroyed everything between them. Damien waited at the front of the great hall, dressed in formal robes that carried none of the exhaustion or fear that had marked his appearance during the trial weeks before, his gray eyes finding Elena's the moment she appeared in the doorway, the same undeniable pull between them as strong and steady as it had been from their very first meeting. She walked toward him slowly, her hand resting protectively on her rounded stomach, surrounded by faces that had once regarded her with suspicion, but now watched with genuine warmth and celebration. Lady Odette, seated near the front alongside several other nobles who had learned hard lessons about the danger of prejudice and hasty judgment, offered a small, sincere smile as Elena passed. Oliver, no longer simply a night guard but now formally recognized for his early kindness during her imprisonment, stood proudly among the palace staff gathered to witness the ceremony. When Elena finally reached Damien's side, he took her hands in his with the same gentle certainty he had shown from their very first meeting in the healing chamber, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as he spoke his vows. I found you in a room full of suffering, and from that moment, I knew my own suffering had finally found its end, he said, his gray eyes never leaving hers. I promised you then that I had found what I was searching for, and every trial we have faced since has only proven that promise true. You have shown this kingdom, and shown me, what true strength looks like, what true healing looks like, in body and in spirit. I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never again have reason to doubt that you belong exactly where you stand today, beside me, as my equal and my queen. Elena, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, spoke her vows in return, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly threatening to overwhelm her. I came to this palace as a stranger, uncertain of my place, in a world so different from anything I had known. I leave that uncertainty behind today, not because the challenges we faced have disappeared, but because I have learned that true belonging comes not from birthright or noble blood, but from the people who choose to stand beside you through every storm. You stood beside me through the darkest days of my life, and I intend to stand beside you, in strength and in healing, for every day that follows. Their kiss, sealing the vows before the entire assembled court, was met with genuine cheers rather than the whispered suspicion that had once shadowed their every interaction. The great hall erupted into celebration, music and laughter filling the space that had witnessed both the beginning of their bond and the near destruction of everything they had built together. The feast that followed carried none of the tension of the earlier ceremony, filled instead with genuine warmth, as nobles who had once doubted Elena's place now approached with sincere congratulations, eager to build the kind of relationship with their new queen that her demonstrated character and resilience had clearly earned. Corwin, now captain of the guard, raised a toast to the couple with evident pride, recounting carefully edited highlights of the investigation that had ultimately proven Elena's innocence, drawing appreciative laughter and applause from the assembled guests. Lucian's fate had been formally decided in the days following the trial, stripped permanently of his titles and lands, sentenced to lifelong exile far from the palace and any position of influence within the kingdom, a consequence severe enough to prevent future scheming, while sparing Damien the difficult burden of harsher punishment against his own blood relative. His absence from the celebration felt, to everyone present, like the closing of a difficult chapter rather than a lingering shadow over the joyful occasion. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Damien found a quiet moment to pull Elena aside, leading her onto a private balcony overlooking the palace gardens, where moonlight illuminated the very herbs and flowers that had played such a crucial role in proving her innocence months before. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked quietly, his hand resting gently over the curve of her stomach, where their child continued growing steadily toward its own arrival into the world. "The fear, the imprisonment, everything you suffered because of the bond we share." Elena considered the question seriously before answering, her hand covering his own where it rested against her stomach. "I regret the pain, and I regret that Lucian's ambitions caused such suffering for both of us. But I do not regret the bond itself or the love that grew from it. Everything we survived only proved how strong that bond truly is. I would choose this path again, Damien, even knowing everything that lay ahead." He pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers, breathing in the familiar warmth that had first drawn them together in that chaotic healing chamber so many months ago. "Then let us build whatever comes next, together, as we always should have from the very beginning." Below them, the sounds of celebration continued drifting up from the great hall, a kingdom finally united in genuine joy rather than suspicion or fear, ready to welcome not just a new queen, but a new beginning, built on truth, resilience, and a bond that had proven itself unbreakable against even the most calculated betrayal. Elena, standing beside the man whose eyes had found hers across a room full of suffering and never truly looked away since, felt certain, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that whatever challenges the future still held, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything before, together, and with a love strong enough to withstand anything the world chose to test it with. The child growing within her stirred gently, as if in quiet agreement, and Elena smiled softly into the warm night air, finally, completely, at peace. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the palace towers with a soft layer of frost, and with it came the moment Elena and Damien had been anticipating, with equal parts excitement and nervous anticipation. Elena's labor began in the middle of a quiet evening, sudden and intense enough that Grace rushed through the palace corridors calling for Margaret before the first hour had even passed. Damien, despite his position and the many crises he had weathered as king, found himself more anxious pacing outside the birthing chamber than he had ever been facing down political threats or physical danger. Corwin stood beside him for much of the night, offering quiet reassurance, though even the steady captain's calm demeanor could not fully settle the king's nerves as hours stretched onward with no news from behind the closed doors. Inside, Margaret worked alongside two of Elena's most trusted apprentices, guiding her through the difficult hours with the same steady confidence Elena herself had shown countless patience throughout her years of practice. The bond between mother and daughter figure held strong through every difficult moment, Margaret's calm voice a constant anchor as Elena focused every ounce of her remaining strength on bringing her child safely into the world. Just as the first light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, a thin, indignant cry finally broke through the tense silence that had settled over the palace throughout the long night. Damien, who had been slumped exhausted against the wall outside, shot upright immediately, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and overwhelming anticipation. Moments later, Margaret opened the chamber door, her tired face split by a wide, joyful smile. "Come meet your daughter, my lord. Both mother and child are healthy and strong." Damien entered the chamber to find Elena propped gently against a mountain of pillows, exhausted but glowing with a happiness that seemed to fill the entire room, a small bundle wrapped carefully in soft blankets cradled against her chest. He crossed to her side immediately, kneeling beside the bed to get his first look at the tiny face peering out from within the blankets, dark hair already visible despite her recent arrival into the world. "She is perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide, gently touching one finger to his daughter's small hand, watching in wonder as tiny fingers curled instinctively around his own. "She has your eyes," Elena said softly, exhaustion evident in her voice, but overshadowed entirely by the joy radiating from her tired smile. "Even now, I can already see it." They named her Isolde, a name Margaret had suggested, meaning fair and beautiful in the old language of the healing traditions Elena had grown up studying. Word of the princess's birth spread through the kingdom within days, greeted with genuine celebration from a populace that had, over the months since the trial, come to deeply respect and admire their new queen's resilience and compassion. The years that followed brought their own challenges, as any life spent balancing royal duty with personal happiness inevitably does. But none carried the same desperate danger that had once threatened to tear Elena and Damien apart entirely. The healing hall Elena had established continued to grow under her careful guidance, eventually expanding into a proper school for healers drawn from villages throughout the kingdom, ensuring that the kind of skilled, compassionate care Elena herself had once struggled to provide with limited resources would remain accessible to people regardless of their birth or standing. Grace remained a constant presence in Elena's life, eventually marrying Oliver in a small, joyful ceremony that Elena and Damien both attended with genuine warmth, watching the young couple build their own happiness within the palace walls that had once been the site of such fear and uncertainty for all of them. Corwin continued serving faithfully as captain of the guard, his sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty proving invaluable time and again as the kingdom slowly rebuilt the trust and stability that Lucian's betrayal had once threatened to destroy completely. Occasionally, news would reach the palace of Lucian's life in exile. Reports of a man living quietly and without incident in a distant, unremarkable corner of a neighboring territory, stripped of the ambition and influence that had once driven him to such desperate and destructive schemes. Damien, though he never fully forgave his cousin's betrayal, found some measure of peace in knowing that justice had been served without requiring the kind of harsh punishment that might have haunted him in quieter moments. Elena, for her part, rarely thought of Lucian at all, too fully absorbed in the life she had built, the daughter she was raising, and the healing work that continued to bring her genuine purpose and joy each day. On the evening of Isolde's third birthday, Elena stood once again in the healing hall, now bustling with apprentices and patients in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first uncertain days when she had arrived at the palace with nothing but a healing bag and an unexpected proposal ringing in her ears. Damien found her there, as he often did during quiet evening hours, watching from the doorway for a moment before crossing the room to wrap his arms gently around her from behind. "Lost in thought again?" he asked, pressing a soft kiss against her temple. "Just remembering," Elena said, leaning back into his familiar warmth, "how far we have come from that first night, when you walked into a room full of sickness and decided, in an instant, that I was the answer to something you had been searching for your whole life. I was right, was I not?" Damien said, a familiar teasing warmth in his voice that had grown only more comfortable with each passing year. Elena turned in his arms to face him fully, her expression soft with a happiness that no longer carried any trace of the fear and uncertainty that had once shadowed even their most joyful moments together. "You were right," she agreed. "Though I do not think either of us truly understood, that first night, everything we would have to overcome to reach this moment." "No," Damien agreed, his gray eyes warm with the same undeniable devotion that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. "But I would face every single moment of it again, without hesitation, knowing it would always lead us here." From somewhere down the hall, the sound of small footsteps announced Isolde's arrival, the young princess rushing into the healing hall with the boundless energy of a child, utterly secure in the love surrounding her on every side, throwing herself into her parents' combined embrace with delighted laughter. Elena lifted her daughter easily, settling her onto her hip, while Damien wrapped his arms around them both. The three of them standing together in the golden evening light of a room that had once represented the beginning of a bond powerful enough to survive betrayal, imprisonment, and the very worst that ambition and jealousy could devise. Outside the healing hall windows, the kingdom continued its steady rhythm of daily life, a place that had weathered its own storm of suspicion and near tragedy to emerge stronger, more united, and more deeply committed to the values of truth and loyalty that had ultimately triumphed over deception. Elena Voss, once a simple village healer summoned to treat a sickness she never expected would change the entire course of her life, had become not just a beloved queen, but a living testament to the idea that true bonds, tested by fire and betrayal, only grow stronger for having survived the trial. And as she stood there, surrounded by everything she had once feared she might lose forever, Elena understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever challenges the future still held in store, she would face them exactly as she always had, with courage, with compassion, and with the unbreakable love of the family she had built against every possible odds standing steadfastly beside her.